Hey everyone, it's me again, back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a story that I know has been blowing up everyone's news feeds. I mean, it seems like everywhere I look, there's another headline about former President Trump's legal battles.
Yeah, it's definitely been hard to keep up with all the twists and turns and, this latest attempt to delay his sentencing in the hush money case. Well, it's raising some really big questions about presidential power and accountability.
Absolutely. And, the core of it all comes down to this pretty fascinating legal quote. Can a former president actually claim immunity to avoid facing consequences for things they did before they even took office?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? It really throws a wrench into how we understand this whole idea of presidential immunity. I mean, typically this doctrine is meant to shield a president from legal entanglements while they're actually in office, to ensure they can carry out their duties without constantly looking over their shoulder.
Right. It's all about protecting the office itself, not necessarily the individual, but applying it retroactively to actions before someone becomes president. Well, that's a whole other can of worms.
Exactly. And, it's important to remember the context here. We're talking about the Manhattan DA's case against Trump, which alleges that he orchestrated a scheme to suppress information about the Stormy Daniels affair right before the 2016 election.
Right. And that alleged scheme is at the heart of the 34 felony counts he was convicted of earlier this year now. With the sentencing gate approaching, Trump's legal team is pulling out all the stops, trying to halt the proceedings, and they're taking their fight all the way to the Supreme Court.
And their main argument is presidential immunity, which, on the surface might sound like a long shot given the timeline we're talking about, actions that allegedly happened before he even stepped foot in the Oval Office.
Yeah, that's what makes it so tricky, right? The DA's case hinges on the argument that this alleged scheme could have impacted the election itself, potentially swaying voters and undermining a fair and democratic process. So they're saying this is a matter of significant public interest.
And from their perspective, there's no basis for the Supreme Court to even get involved, especially since Trump hasn't exhausted his appeal options within the state court system. It's a procedural argument, but it does carry some weight.
I mean, it does make you wonder if this is a way to bypass the normal channels, hoping for a more favorable outcome from the highest court in the land. But what's even more interesting is that in previous federal case, one that's actually closely related to these same actions, Trump's legal team argued the exact opposite.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They actually conceded that the actions in question were not covered by presidential immunity. And the Manhattan DA, they're not letting that slide. They're using it as ammunition against Trump's current defense.
It's like a legal chess match, with each side trying to outmaneuver the other. So where does this leave the DA's case overall? How strong is their position?
Well, they're really hammering home this idea that this is a state-level criminal matter, not a federal one. They're saying there's simply no justification for the Supreme Court to intervene.
And they're not just stopping there. They're also challenging a very foundation of Trump's immunity claim.
Exactly. They're arguing that presidential immunity simply shouldn't apply to actions taken before someone becomes president. I mean, think about the implications if immunity could be applied retroactively like that.
Right. It's like saying you get a get-out-of-jail-free card for anything you did before you took office. It sets a pretty dangerous precedent.
It does. And the DA is really emphasizing that point. What kind of message would that send to future presidents? It could create a situation where individuals feel emboldened to act with impunity before taking office, knowing they might be shielded from consequences later on.
It really raises questions about the balance of power and accountability.
Yeah.
Could this scenario potentially erode the very principle of holding those in power responsible for their actions?
And that's what makes this case so significant. It's not just about Trump. It's about the potential ramifications for the presidency itself and for the future of American democracy.
So we're left with this huge question hanging in the air. Will the Supreme Court actually step in?
Well, legal experts seem to be leaning towards no. The general consensus is that Trump's motion is procedurally flawed, that it lacks a solid legal basis for federal involvement in what's essentially a state matter.
So if they decide to stay out of it, what happens then?
Well, the sentencing would likely proceed as scheduled. Now, it's important to note that in this specific case, jail time for Trump isn't really anticipated, but the sentencing itself is a significant development. It marks a pivotal point in his ongoing legal battles and opens the door for appeals through the proper channels of the state court system.
So this is far from over. This whole saga could drag on for years with appeals and legal maneuvering.
Oh, absolutely. This is just one chapter in a much larger story, and the outcome of this case will undoubtedly have ripple effects that we'll be feeling for years to come.
All right, well, buckle up, everyone, because this ride is far from over.
It's kind of wild how a case that started with hush money and accusations of election interference has morphed into this huge debate about, like, the bedrock of our legal system, you know?
Yeah, it's like we've stumbled onto this behind-the-scenes look at the gears of our democracy, and what we're seeing is this intense power struggle between different parts of the government, each one flexing its muscles and interpreting the law in its own way.
Right. It forces us to ask these fundamental questions about how power is spread out, and how those at the top are held accountable. What limits should there even be for those in, like, the highest office in the country?
And it really does feel like we're living through a real-life legal thriller. Every day, there's another twist, a new development, some legal maneuver that just keeps everyone on the edge of their seats.
It's like proof of how complex our legal system is, There are all these layers of precedent and interpretation and arguments all coming together in this high-stakes battle that could, like, rewrite how we understand executive power.
It's easy to get lost in the weeds, all the technicalities of motions and appeals. But I think it's important to remember the human side of all this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Behind all those legal arguments and court filings, there are real people whose lives are deeply entwined with this case. We have Stormy Daniels, whose accusation started this whole thing. We have Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, who went from loyal fixer to key witness for the prosecution.
Right. And there's David Pecker, the former publisher of the National Enquirer, who admitted to being part of a scheme to bury negative stories about Trump during the campaign.
Yeah, exactly. These are all real people with their own motives, their own vulnerabilities, their own stories. And it reminds us that even in those powerful circles, human relationships and choices have far-reaching consequences.
And it underscores the idea that power can be a double-edged sword, It can be used for good, but it can also be abused, leading to sometimes devastating outcomes.
No doubt. And this case has also sparked a lot of discussion about the role of the media in a democracy. The hush money payment was meant to keep this whole thing under wraps, but it was investigative journalism that brought it to light.
It's a reminder that a free press is vital for a working democracy. Without it, we'd be in the dark, vulnerable to manipulation and abuse of power.
Absolutely. And we can't forget the role of the public either.
Yeah.
The massive interest in this case shows how deeply concerned people are about the integrity of our institutions, about fairness in our legal system, and about the accountability of those we give power to.
Yeah. It's a reminder that we, the people, are ultimately the guardians of our democracy. It's our responsibility to stay informed, think critically, and hold our leaders to the highest standards.
So we have this high-stakes legal battle, a cast of characters straight out of a drama and a media frenzy that's got the whole nation's attention. What happens next?
Well, everyone's waiting with bated breath for the Supreme Court's decision. Their ruling will decide what happens immediately with the case, but it could also impact the future of the presidency itself.
It's a defining moment, a real test of the checks and balances that are meant to protect our democracy.
It's like watching this giant game of legal chess, where every move is calculated, every decision carries huge weight. And how this game ends could shape the political landscape for years to come.
That's why we do these deep dives,
Yeah.
It's not just about repeating the facts or getting lost in legal jargon. It's about understanding the wider context, the human stories, and what this all means for the future of our nation.
Exactly. We want our listeners to have the knowledge they need to form their own opinions, to have meaningful conversations, and to become active participants in shaping the future of our democracy.
Yeah.
We've really gone deep, haven't we? From legal arguments to potential outcomes and even the historical context. It's a lot to process. But, beyond all the courtroom drama and political maneuvering, there's another layer to this whole thing. I think we need to talk about public perception.
It's really interesting how this case has become such a lightning rod. It's like a focal point for all these deeply held beliefs and anxieties about the state of the country. People are projecting their own hopes and fears onto this legal battle like it's a miniature version of bigger societal conflicts.
It's like we're looking in a mirror, and what we see staring back is a nation divided, struggling with these fundamental questions about fairness, accountability, even the nature of justice itself.
Exactly. For some, this case just confirms their belief that certain people are above the law, that power and privilege shield you from consequences.
While for others, it's a sign that the system actually works, that even those at the very top can be held accountable for their actions.
The reactions are so strong, so emotional, that it's hard to even have a calm conversation about the legal and political details without someone getting defensive.
Yeah, it's a reminder that this isn't just about abstract legal principles. We're
Right.
dealing with really personal beliefs about right and wrong, about who deserves punishment and who deserves protection.
And those beliefs often come from our own experiences, our social and economic realities, the stories we tell ourselves about how the world works.
It's easy to get caught up in the legal back and forth, to focus on the procedures and strategies, but we have to step back and recognize those emotional undercurrents that are fueling so much of the public discussion around this case.
Absolutely. We can't ignore the anger, the frustration, the sense of betrayal that so many people feel, regardless of which side they're on.
And we have to find ways to bridge those divides, to have respectful conversations, to actually listen to each other's perspectives, even when we completely disagree.
I know it's easier said than done, but it's crucial if we want to keep our democracy healthy.
So here we are at a crossroads. The Supreme Court's decision is looming, and the potential consequences are huge. It's a moment of uncertainty, of reckoning, a moment that will truly test our collective wisdom and our commitment to the rule of law.
And as we wait for the court's ruling, let's remember that the true measure of a nation isn't just its laws, it's the character of its people, our capacity for empathy, compassion, and justice.
This deep dive has taken us on quite a journey. We began with a seemingly simple legal question and ended up exploring some of the biggest questions about power accountability and the very soul of our nation.
That's the power of these deep dives, isn't it? Connecting the dots, seeing the bigger picture, understanding how seemingly isolated events are all part of a larger story.
We started with a specific case, but we ended up talking about something much larger, something much more profound. The very essence of who we are as a people and what kind of future we want to build for ourselves and for generations to come. This has been The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.